I'm David Haynes. I'm the opinions editor at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Welcome to this special edition of Fourth and State, a video service of the editorial board. Today we're joined by Governor Scott Walker, a Republican who is running for re-election this fall. This is one in a series of candidate interviews that we are conducting, all of them streamed live this week at JSOnline. We'll meet with Mary Burke, the Democratic challenger for governor, at 10:15 on Wednesday morning. Now, each year during the election season, the editorial board invites candidates to sit down with us and discuss the issues. That's exactly what we're going to do this afternoon with Governor Walker. Then we plan to publish a series of editorials based on these interviews and other research that we do. We will not make endorsements in any of these races. We're joined today by members of the Journal Sentinel's news staff. The editorial board operates independently from the news staff, but we do sit in on one another's meetings. So now let's meet Governor Walker. Governor Walker is a former Milwaukee County executive, and before that was a member of the Wisconsin legislature. He was first elected governor in 2010 and then won re-election in a recall election in 2012. Governor, welcome back to Fourth and State.
Good to be back here.
Good to have you. Thanks for being here. Let's start with this. You've said in the past that you favor transparency in campaign contributions, and yet according to documents that were uncovered in the John Doe investigation into your campaign, your own campaign encouraged donors to give to Wisconsin Club for Growth so that those donations would remain secret. I wonder how you square that, especially given the fact that a mining company that was seeking a bill in the legislature gave $700,000 to the club. Doesn't this give citizens some reason to question your credibility on that issue?
No, I mean, the larger issue of mining, it's not like I changed my position. I mean, heck, I stood, as many of the reporters here know, in front of the whole state on statewide television with a bunch of union operating engineers and carpenters saying, I want to mine in northern Wisconsin. I want to have legislation that allows for safe and environmentally sound mining in the state of Wisconsin. So this is not something where I ran 4 years ago in one position and did something different. And per the specifics you mentioned, it's actually for an organization that at that time, I didn't have a recall. I wasn't a candidate for anything. I was the governor of the state of Wisconsin. And what we were trying to do was address the many thousands, if not tens of thousands or more dollars worth of ads that were destroying the facts about the reforms that we did with Act 10 far before any elections that were out there, really trying to get at the heart of the issue and start telling people the facts. And the more people knew the facts, the more things changed in this state.
What about this issue of transparency, though? In the past, I know you've said donors ought to be public. Why is that not the case for these kind of donations?
Well, I think donors should be public when they give the campaign committees. I hope that in the future we do more to encourage people to give the political parties, whether it's the Democrat Party, the Republican Party, the Greene County, others. I think one of the biggest challenges we've had over the past 20, 25 years is there's been a move away from parties and into these other organizations out there.
Outside groups.
Yeah, outside groups. But I think the bottom line is you got to do it in a way that's balanced with what the U.S. Constitution says.
Jason Stein.
Governor, you said yesterday that you'd like to see a shift from the gas tax. You're considering a shift from the gas tax to the sales tax on gas to fund roads. At the same time, you said you wanted to be revenue neutral. 5 cents on the dollar on $3 gas doesn't get us to the 30 cents we have right now on the gas tax. So help us understand what you're really talking about there.
Yeah, for us, just so it's clear, what I said at that particular editorial board meeting yesterday was they asked what sort of options are you looking at. I said one of them is like this. We've asked Mark Gottlieb, our Secretary of Transportation, spent about a year on the road talking with stakeholders and citizens across the state as to what's the right approach, what's the right focus. We believe transportation is not just about the building and design and construction and maintenance of roads and bridges and freight rail and ports and airports. It's really about the impact it has on commerce overall, from manufacturing to agriculture to lumber to retail to tourism, for that matter. And so we know that we had to backfill in a $1.4 billion shortfall that was existed because Jim Doyle raided money from that transportation fund. It's an issue hopefully will never happen again in the future, because on this fall's ballot, there's a constitutional amendment that would prohibit those sorts of raids, but we had to fill that back in and then have to build off it in the future. That's where the gap is going forward. It's largely driven by the fact that there not only was a hole, but then over the years as we filled the hole in, we didn't keep pace with the needs to fill in the potholes and all the other challenges that local, county, and state government heads with transportation issues across the state. So different options out there. The biggest problem we have right now in the state is really twofold. The gas tax itself is by far, we're too dependent on primarily that source. We get a little bit out of the vehicle registration fee in this state, but Wisconsin, unlike a lot of other states out there, really is dependent on the gas tax and a little bit from the vehicle registration fee. On top of that, the other problem is increasingly as cars and vehicles become more fuel efficient, this is a problem at both the state and at the federal level. The gas tax is based on gallons of gas purchased. As the gallons of gas go down, the gas tax collections go down, even though those vehicles put the same wear and tear, if not more, on the roads and infrastructure that we have. So we said, look at all the different options out there. For us, one of the options that we're seriously considering is whether or not you would eliminate or drive down the gas tax and then fill in a sales tax, not the current sales tax, but specific to gas. So in place of basing it on gallons purchased, you base it on the price of the gas purchase. It still would be a segregated fee. It wouldn't be a new sales tax or a different sales tax than what we have at the state level. It would be specific to gas. The difference is it would be on the price as opposed to gallons purchased, which, again, both here and across the country continues to go down. We just need to have a stable source out there. And part of the reason there's a gap is because the gas tax the last few years has been going down and will be in the foreseeable future.
So it could be more than 5 cents on the dollar?
Well, it would be specific to it would be the parallel from what we pay right now. I mean, right now you're essentially paying the same sort of thing. You just base it on gallons. If I filled up my car and what the equivalent would be in paying it on the gallons purchased as a gas tax, then what would be the translation into what would that mean if I paid in the same amount of money, but instead it was based on the sale of that gas? Because again, that's a steady thing that doesn't drop on miles traveled. And in the larger context, any of these changes we'd be looking at to try and firm up the transportation fund would be done in an overall budget that would have to lower the overall tax burden on the taxpayers of this state. So property and income taxes would have to go down in this budget, even as we made other changes as it relates to transportation.
Governor, I have a couple of questions on abortion that actually don't require long answers. Did you write the ad on abortion where you faced the camera and discussed your views?
Yeah, I talked about it. I didn't do it alone. I've talked with other people about it, but those are my words.
Okay. You say at the end of the ad that your priority is to protect the health and safety of all citizens of Wisconsin. Do you believe a fetus is a citizen?
Well, I believe an unborn child is an important, I mean, when Matt and Alex, before they were born, one on June 30th, the other on July 31st, I, like a lot of parents and grandparents these days, showed their first picture, which was the ultrasound that they had, and was proud about that. And it's like a lot of grandparents, friends that I have now, who will show them off those same sorts of pictures on their iPhones.
So is an unborn child a citizen of the state of Wisconsin, in your view?
Well, years ago, when we passed a law in this state that allowed penalties to be exerted against someone that caused bodily harm, not only to an individual, but to that unborn child, that was something the state of Wisconsin recognizes, not just me. And I said, and the reason at the time I said that, I remember debating about that when I was in the legislature. And I said, if God forbid at that time, we still had an old Chrysler minivan, and Matt and Alex were pretty young, and I said, a few years ago, I had one son that was born, and the other one came a year, a month, and a day later. I said, if God forbid something had happened where someone rammed into our car, and Tonette had been injured, and we had lost our son Alex, who Tonette was pregnant with at the time, I asked people at that chamber then, as I'd ask people right now, you wouldn't send just a get well card, you'd probably send a sympathy card to us because we lost that unborn child. And so I think that's a normal reaction people have, regardless of where they stand politically on the overall issue of the sanctity of life.
4 years ago, I believe it was, you told the editorial board that you opposed abortion even in the event of rape or incest. Is that still your view?
Well, I said I'm pro-life, and to me, as I pointed out the other night in the debate, the Supreme Court more than 40 years ago made it clear what states can or can't do. They made it very clear in a decision more than 40 years ago that applied to all the states across the country, which is why the debates since then, not just since I've been governor, but since that time, have been about particular issues like those we've been talking about the last few years, not on that particular issue.
Well, that brings me to the last question. Wisconsin Right to Life, I believe, has made it part of its agenda to pass legislation banning abortions after 20 weeks. Do you believe abortion should be banned after 20 weeks?
Those are all things we'd have to look at in the future session out there.
Well, you support, I believe you co-sponsored a bill back in '98 saying abortion should be banned after 20 weeks. So I want to pin you down. Should abortion be banned after 20
Again, I
weeks?
said those are all things that we'll certainly look at in the next
No,
legislature.
your personal view, not a legislative view, your personal view.
Well, I
What
mean,
is it?
I think it's a human life, and I think that's something that people, regardless of where they stand politically, but those are things that we'll have to talk about in the next legislative session if it comes up.
So can I take it that you believe abortion should be banned after 20 weeks?
Well, again, I think it's a human life, so that obviously raises some concerns for me. The things we focused in on the last session were relatively simple and direct forward. Things we talked about the other night in terms of the legislation I supported that I think increases safety and yet provides more information for a woman considering her options.
I have one follow-up to your question, and that is, you've been endorsed repeatedly by Pro-Life Wisconsin. They have as part of their agenda that certain contraceptives are abortifacients, such as RU-486, IUDs, Ella, and other things. Do you agree with their position?
Well, I mean, you talk about different variations. I haven't been against birth control.
You don't see any form of birth control as an abortifacient?
Again, it all depends on what you define as birth control. But again, you guys are asking a lot of interesting questions that, quite honestly, Bill, you've been out with me on the road, I don't hear anyone ask. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of like the questions the other night on the debate. Questions people ask me about are their schools, are their kids' college education. They ask me about jobs and whether or not their neighbor is going to be, who was unemployed years ago, is going to get a job back. We can spend all of our time talking about this, but I mean, James, you've even talked before. I've written many of your pieces about the unemployment rate on the north side of Milwaukee and the challenges there. To me, I don't mind getting in the minutia there, but I mean, honestly, I'd challenge you to come out with me. You're not going to find a day that goes by where any of the details you're asking me about, there are things that ask me in great detail. So you can ask them, but we got a limited amount of time, and I would think people would want to hear about the things that matter most to them.
Let me jump in here, just to change the topic a little bit. And people, please, you could use the hashtag JSelections. I have a question from a reader, and the question goes as follows. Does your proposal to deny food stamps and unemployment insurance benefits to individuals who test positive for drugs, would that apply to veterans, including veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan? Or do you propose to create an exception for veterans?
No, what we do overall is somebody who didn't pass the test, we'd work the next step, we'd get them in place in the program that we have about the state and the county level to get them free of that addiction. The reason we point that out is if somebody is an able-bodied adult without children, who's able to work, they don't have kids, they're not a senior citizen, and right now we know there are job opportunities out there. We know the two basic things we hear from employers all across the state. Every week, nearly every day, are employers who say, get me people who can do two basic things, people who know how to work and people who can pass a drug test. Overwhelmingly hear it in transportation, in healthcare. I hear it in other areas like IT and manufacturing as well. And so it just seems ridiculous to me that if our goal is not to make people permanently dependent on the government, if our goal is to help people transition into not just a job, but a career that can support themselves and someday their family, why would we set them up for failure by not making those sorts of expectations as a part of us providing assistance? To get basic employability skills, I'm one of the few states in the country where I put my money where my mouth is, $17 million into employability training. And along with that, because I hear, and this, the other night someone asked me what's new, this is one of the things that is new, and I heard it in the last year from employers who just say, you know, I love all the money you put in the training for worker training and technical college and all that. They said, but we are so desperate for workers. We'll train them ourselves, but we can't find people who know how to work, and we can't find people who can pass a drug test.
Let me do a follow-up. I have another question from someone who says, why are you demanding drug testing for public benefits at the same time that you cut funding for teen drug rehab services?
Again, I don't know what the particulars are. I know overall we put resources in at both the county and the state level, but our expectation in the future with this program would be if someone needs our assistance, if they don't pass the drug test, we'd find a way to get them plugged in to alcohol and drug abuse treatment so that they could, because our ultimate goal is not punitive. Our ultimate goal is to help people find work. I mean, to me, that's the difference. I mean, that's one of the fundamental differences, I think, between my opponent and I. My opponent, many of our allies, I think, well-intentioned maybe, but measure success in government by how many people are dependent on the government. by how many people are on food stamps, how many people are on unemployment, how many people are on Medicaid. My belief of success in government is just the opposite, by how many people are no longer dependent on the government. Not because we kick them out in the cold, because we understand in the end, true freedom and prosperity doesn't come from the mighty hand of the government. It comes from empowering people, the dignity that comes from work, to control their own lives and their own destiny. Most people, I would contend today, most people who are temporarily dependent on the government, there's exceptions for those who have long-term disabilities or other challenges out there, but for most people who are temporarily in need of our assistance, they don't want to be. They want an opportunity to live their own life, whether the American dream for them might be owning their own business, starting it up someday and owning their business. For others, it might be owning their own home. For others, it might be just as simple as not having to live paycheck to paycheck. Whatever that piece of the American dream is, to me, we don't get that by encouraging long-term dependency on the government. We get it by encouraging people to do what I think is in our nature, and that is want to work.
Let me just go back though, but has teen drug rehab services been cut?
I'd have to go back and look at what they're specifically referencing. I don't know.
Governor, are you saying that you would put additional money into getting people that test positive off of drugs? Because I haven't heard you say that.
Yeah, we try and find some ways to make the correlation so that if we found people that didn't pass, and we don't think it's a huge number, but we think it's just one of those things that we hear. This is the difference between some states that have just done this for assistance versus how we package this in our overall plan called Continue Wisconsin's Comeback, where we have multiple components to it.
I've read the plan, though.
Yeah.
I haven't seen, there's nothing.
No,
in the
and we even
plan
talked about that, but I said,
additional money
when people
for-
ask about it, that would be for us the next step, is to say, our goal is not to be punitive. Other states that have done it have done this largely on this issue alone. Our focus has been tying it into the employability skills, the $17 million we put in the last budget, the fact that we're one of the few states that does that, because our interest is trying to find a way to put people to work, not to punish them, but rather to, not to be punitive, but to put people back into the workplace.
I had a question from your debate the other day. A lot of the focus was on your line about we don't have a jobs problem and so forth, but there was another line in there that caught my attention. You were asked if you thought someone could live on the minimum wage in the state, and you said we should be trying to come up with jobs that pay more than that. And then you said the way you do that is not by setting an arbitrary amount by the state. That sounds like you're not a particular fan of the minimum wage. What is your position on the minimum wage? Should we have it?
Well, I'm not going to repeal it, but I don't think I don't think it serves a purpose, because we're debating then about what the lowest levels are at. I want people to make, like I said the other night, 2 or 3 times that. The jobs I focus on, the programs we put in place, the training we're putting in place is not for people to get minimum wage jobs. It's the training, whether it's in apprenticeships, whether it's in our tech colleges, whether it's our UW system. It's to try and provide the training, the skills, the talents, the expertise that people need to create careers that pay many, many times over. And the examples I gave, last Friday when I was coming up, one of my stops was in Stevens Point. Skyward is a company we helped, $34 million investment, 184,000 square foot facility, hundreds of employees they have right now that have good paying jobs. Over the next several years, they're going to add 510 more positions, and the average pay for those positions is $20 an hour. I mentioned another place the other day, Forte Research in Middleton, 55 new jobs we helped out with. Average pay, starting pay is $33 an hour, actually a little bit more than that. Just up at Bemis Healthcare Packaging the other day, where we announced plans to help them double the size of their employment. Those jobs are about $18 per hour. Those are the kinds of focus. It's twofold. It's getting people the education and training they need to succeed, to create the skill sets they need to take on jobs and careers that pay multiple times bigger than what anybody's proposing for the minimum wage, and parallel to that, helping employers go out and create the kind of jobs that are going to do just that.
So you said you don't believe the minimum wage serves any purpose.
Well, no, I said it's for that standpoint. I said I'm not going to repeal it. It's there. I mean, I think that
Right.
that takes you down a different path than Mario. I think the best thing we should be doing is driving that up. I mean, there's a real difference. For example, I mentioned this the other night too, between me years ago when I was in high school flipping burgers at McDonald's.
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting to make $15 an hour, because that's a job I had in high school that I worked part-time at to save up for going for college. To me, that's different than somebody who's expecting a job that's going to have them pay for their family and themselves. Those are the sorts of things where we're much better off if we help people get into jobs and careers that are paying much higher than that.
But until those jobs come back, you have a lot of adults working in those flipping burger jobs as you described.
But you know, the
Trying to-
challenge is not just the jobs. This is my point the other day. The challenge is both, yes, in a case, some of the cases jobs, but today, if you go to right now to jobcenterwisconsin.com, even in the state, even in not only the state, but even here in the Milwaukee area, there's almost 80,000 job openings posted on that. And there's a wide spectrum of different types of jobs, but the challenge is that we haven't done enough, and it's why we've invested over $100 million this past year, $28 million alone just this summer in our technical colleges, to say one of the biggest challenges is getting people the skills. It's not just that the jobs are there or not, it's that for the jobs that would pay that kind of money, we need people who have the skills to fill those, whether it's in manufacturing, information technology, healthcare, transportation. I mean, there's just all sorts of jobs out there, but we don't always have, particularly in areas of high unemployment, we don't have people with the skill sets to fill those. And so we've got to be much more aggressive and targeted in saying we've got to match the employers who are looking for people to fill these high-paying or higher-paying family-supporting jobs, and people who are not only looking for a job, in many cases looking for a better job, because some people may be in those entry-level positions you just talked about. We need to find a way to get them to be able to move up and move on and to get the skill sets, whether it's as a certified nursing assistant or an IT technician or somebody who's working as a CNC operator. Those are all things that our investments, for example, at ME2C and others, those are all the types of positions we just added statewide almost 5,000 more spots into.
So when polls in the state show that people want the minimum wage increased, what don't they understand? You don't agree with
Oh,
that?
I do. I think what they want is, what they say is, I want wages to go up. Not just the minimum wage.
Well,
I think
no,
it-
they say, the question is, do
Yeah,
you
but
want the
that-
minimum
but-
wage
but-
increased?
Okay, but ask a poll. You can ask anything. If you sat down and asked the same group of people who are polled, what do you mean by that? And I would challenge people to go do that. Ask people, what do they mean about that? Do you mean it should be a specific dollar or not? No, what they mean more than anything is they think wages should go up. Wages for others who are getting by and themselves. Most people who are polled on that don't live off the minimum wage, but they too want their wages to go up. Why? Because years ago, in the 4 years before I was governor, not only did the state lose 133,000 jobs, for a lot of people in the state, as I traveled the state from one end to the other, I found people not only who were worried about losing their job, I found as many or more people who were worried for their families because they took a pay cut to keep their job. Well, you know, one of the most interesting or referenced ads is the ad I did a month or two back about me coming out of a hole in the ground. Of course, it was a metaphor for the state. The $3.6 billion budget deficit, the taxes going up, the challenges that we inherited with jobs. But it was also in many ways a metaphor for a lot of families in the state who in 2009 and 2010 and even before that had taken pay cuts in order to keep jobs. One of the women I mentioned beginning my comments the other night, a woman named Sandy from the Wausau area, classic example of this. Before she got laid off, she had actually taken a pay cut in order to try and preserve her job. Now, in her case, it was a double whammy. She still ended up getting laid off. Others kept their jobs, but they maybe got a 5 or 10% pay cut. And it wasn't just in big businesses. A lot of small businesses, in fact, a lot of small business owners I've talked to themselves didn't take pay for a while because they didn't want to lay people off or they didn't want it to be as big of a hit. And so I think the reaction that people have out there is not just to what the rate is at, because remember, I mean, there's any number of reports, not just from business-related groups. The Congressional Budget Office, I believe, has done a nationwide report that suggests that some of the raises they're talking about would cost up to $500,000 or half a million jobs across the country. And who would that impact? Overwhelmingly people looking for part-time work, seasonal work, high schools. We talk here a lot. When I was at the county, we did a summer youth program along with the city of Milwaukee. At the state, we've helped fund some of that. There's no doubt, I think the evidence is pretty unequivocal. If there were changes here, that would impact the number of young people who got jobs next summer and beyond. So to me, instead of focusing on what that is, which would have a negative impact on people looking for that seasonal or youthful employment, what I want to do is figure out a way, how do we raise wages for everybody, particularly for those looking to support their family off the job.
So let me stay with jobs for a minute.
Yeah.
Because a question from one of our readers. And the question was, you're not going to fulfill your campaign pledge of the state's private industry creating 250,000 jobs by the end of your first term. So how should voters hold you accountable?
Well, a couple things. I think people, I hope in the end, and I believe listening to voters around the state, aren't going to penalize me for aiming high. Remember why we got here. It wasn't just an arbitrary number. We looked at the jobs that were lost in the 4 years before I was governor, when Jim Doyle was the governor. which invoked policies that my opponent has said in the past she supports entirely. This state lost 133,000 jobs. We lost 27,000 businesses. We were ranked in the bottom 10, at least according to one publication, in terms of places to do business in. And our statewide chamber at that time did a survey of employers that didn't really show much optimism for the future. 1 out of 10% of all the employers surveyed in the state said we're heading in the right direction. So we inherited a huge jobs problem. Since then, we've added over 100,000 jobs. We've added about 25,000 businesses. We've gone from being ranked 41st in the country to 14th in the country in terms of the business climate. And now, instead of 10% of our employers saying we're heading in the right direction, we're now up to 96%. In fact, just in the last month or so, Manpower, just down the way here, but a global company, came out and said, as they did their survey of employers, which say how many are going to retract, how many are going to keep the same, how many are going to grow, the net increase is about double, actually more than double it was a year ago at this time for the fourth quarter. You look at, there's no doubt, we've talked about this before at this editorial board, there's no doubt that the protest in the first year, followed by the first wave of recalls, followed by the second wave of recalls, left an incredible amount of uncertainty amongst employers in the state. That's the number one thing employers tell me they're concerned about is certainty. There was uncertainty in the state, and so we had a slow go to begin with. But I would challenge people to look at the last year. If you look at July over July numbers, year over year, we're third in the Midwest. If you look at August over August, we're about the same. We're at fourth. I would imagine September's numbers in the next week or so will be pretty similar out there. We don't rank where my opponent says. We actually rank in the top 5 because we've seen tremendous growth. So I would ask people to look at not just that goal. We said a lot. I made a lot of promises. You guys follow a lot of those on PolitiFact. I've kept a significant majority of those. And so I'd ask people to look at that. But the other thing I'd ask is people to say, not only did he hit that goal, but if our goal is to build off of that going forward, who's got the plan to do that? And let's compare records. Because remember, when my opponent was not just working for Jim Doyle, she was working as the head of the Commerce Department in pretty good years, 2005, 2006, and 2007. So you can't blame it on a national recession or anything else. This state had about half the number of jobs created, had a rate of growth that was below where we've been at the last 3 years. It was ranked 42nd in the country. So just using her numbers alone, you'd say, well, the track record's pretty clear. The policies she was involved with, that she said she supported entirely, didn't work even in better economic times. We've done better over the last 3 years, and I think over the next 4, we're going to do even better going forward.
So would you establish some employment goals or metrics for your coming term?
I think in our standpoint, we're going to talk about how we want to be one of the top performers in the Midwest. We want to eventually be one of the top performers in the country. It's why we've highlighted the sentiments of employers, and now we want to make sure the jobs over the next few years match up with our growth from going in the bottom 10 to the top 15, and eventually we'd like to be in the top 10, not only in terms of the perception of employers when they're surveyed, but ultimately in terms of job growth.
Governor, you've been very good about coming to the editorial board and meeting with us over the course of your administration.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking back to the first time you were here when you were running for governor. There was no inkling or indication in what you shared with us at that time that you would turn to effectively neutralizing public employee unions to help bridge the budget deficit that the state faced. How did you decide on that as the right prescription for filling the budget gap? When did that happen, and how did it happen?
Yeah, well, there's stages, and I've laid this out for in parts in my book, Unintimidated, but you think back, even in the 2010 campaign before the election, I ran ads. I actually ran TV ads that said I want a 5 and 12% contribution for pensions and health care from public employees, me included. And so we laid out to get there that we thought, even with that, it's still far better than the average worker has in the state. The average worker is matching, at minimum, is matching their retirement, which is what we asked for. And the average worker in this state is paying about 20 to 25%. So the 12.8 is still pretty generous compared to others. But we laid that out. In fact, we laid out some other statements that we made, so much so that AFT Wisconsin actually ran a flyer that we've pointed to multiple times in the past that said he's going to take back collective bargaining, he's going to change that. I said at the education conference right over here at the convention center that as a public official I could relate to what school board members and other officials were going through and wanted to significantly change things to put the power back in their hands to control their budgets and the way that they ran their schools. All that happened up front. We didn't say on this bill on February 11, 2011, we're going to introduce this exact bill. But then something else happened between the election and the time I took office. oftentimes we forget about because so much has gone on in the last few years, and that is the state public employee unions rushed out to ram through employee contracts that would have locked us in to just unattainable spending levels over the next few years of my tenure. They tried to do that in a lame duck session when Democrats were still in charge of the Assembly and the Senate with hopefully a favorable Democrat governor. And ironically, it was two Democrat senators, Jeff Plaley and Russ Decker, a former union official himself, who was then the Senate Democratic leader but who had lost his election, who to his credit said, we shouldn't lock, if the people voted, they made a change, we shouldn't lock them into that. Well, any hope, any discussions, any premise that we had that the Public Employees Union asked me in particular would be willing to sit down and negotiate was made pretty clear at that point that they weren't. They were going in an all-out strategy to try and ram this through before, and if it hadn't been for the courage of those two Democrat senators to stand up and say, no, the people spoke, we should give them a chance to have their say, we would have been locked into that. And had we been locked into that, we would have had to make some pretty devastating cuts because the choices we were given weren't very solid out there. So we looked at that, looked at the size of the budget, realized if we were going to change one of the biggest pieces of our budget, which is aid to local governments, the only way you could do that is if you gave those local governments the ability to control their own destiny and to invoke enough savings to make up for those budget changes.
Will you push for fire and police to be part of Act 10?
No, I mean, to me, the same reason why I'm going to push to not bring up right to work or things like that is because that just takes us down that same path. It reopens all those same debates. My plan's about education reform, tax reform, entitlement reform, continuing to weed out waste, fraud, and abuse. I think getting into the weeds in those other areas, whether it's with fire and police, whether it's with right to work or other issues like that, just brings back the whole firestorm again. And I think for the good of the people of the state, those aren't the sort of debates that are helpful for us to take the next leap forward. If we talk about worker training, workforce development, infrastructure investments, those are all things that Democrat and Republicans, with some minor differences, can largely agree on. Those are things that bring people together. Those are the things I want to do over the next 4 years.
Governor, I've heard you say a couple times that things like right to work and some of the abortion legislation is not a priority. Can you explain how that's, if you would sign those bills when they showed up on your desk, how is that different for a voter? Is this code for saying you're going to go to members of your party in the legislature and say, don't give me these bills?
On right to work and things like that, I have. I'm not silent about that. I've said, and somebody said, well, years ago you supported it. Yeah, I did when I was in the legislature. But what I'm saying is, for the reason I just mentioned you, Marty, it's not even just about whether I think the policy is good or bad. It's about the tenor and the tone of the legislature and what it means ultimately to the state as a whole. And so, particularly on that particular issue and any other changes, substantive changes to Act 10, I just think that opens a whole nother can of worms out there. And so I'm saying it right here. I'm not going to just quietly say it. I'm saying it to people right now who are listening in or watching. That's my focal point, particularly when it comes to issues that would reinvigorate the kind of debate we had a few years ago. It was tough, along the way people said, "What have you learned from it?" Well, one, that if we can avoid it, I don't want to go through that kind of scenario. Having said that, though, I don't think I was wrong for doing it. I think where I was wrong, the mistakes I made, were that I was so eager to fix things, I just ran out to fix them instead of talking about it. The reason is because most politicians talk about things and never fix them. And so, not that there wouldn't have been some of the in-state and national union leaders that wouldn't have been upset with it, but the bottom line is I think if people had known early on, for example, the story of Megan Sampson, the teacher in Milwaukee who 4 years ago got named the Outstanding Teacher of the Year, and then not long after that was laid off by NPS because of the old collective bargaining agreements, people might have said, hey, that's not fair, you need to fix that. Or if I told about the transit bus drivers in Madison who made more than $150,000 a year because of overtime abuses, people said, you need to fix that. Or the correctional officers who would call in sick and then work the next shift on overtime, getting paid double overtime pay, I think people would have said, you need to fix it. I didn't tell those stories until after we had done that. And so what I've learned going forward is, if stay true to your principles. If there's something you need to do, you need to lay it out. You need to tell people what you're doing and why you're doing it, not just after the fact, but up front. But then you shouldn't use that as an excuse for inaction. But for in areas where if it has a marginal impact one way or the other, then don't get diverted in those battles. Stay focused on the things that are going to move the state forward.
I think because you've been so open about where you stand on things, that's why we wonder, would you sign a right-to-work bill? Would you sign some of the abortion bills that?
Well,
that
again,
Bill has
reasonable
talked
things.
about?
Yeah, I'm pro-life. I mean, I don't, that part shouldn't shock anybody. I'm pro-life. It doesn't shock anybody. The legislation I've signed in the past, I've mentioned it to you. As you mentioned the last 4 years ago when I sat here at this editorial board. So that, I don't think that shocks anybody. It shouldn't shock any of the voters because that's not something I've hidden away. So when I say that, don't I think there's two different things between the, and I don't say you're misinterpreting it, but just so people listening in get this, there's a difference between Act 10 revisions or right to work versus other pieces of legislation out there. My overall comment has been people elected me largely to focus on economic and fiscal issues. And so just as a publisher, if you said, I'm hiring you to do this, and you said, well, here are 5 other things I've done well on, you'd say, that's great, but here are the 2 things I told you you'd be judged on. You wouldn't give me extra credit for the 5 other things if I was not working on the 2 things you asked me to do. And so I think the voters asked me to work on economic and fiscal issues. That's why I made it my top priority over the last 3.5 years, and I will for the next 4 years. In terms of then other issues, yeah, there's all sorts of other things. There's unemployment compensation and workers' comp. There's all sorts of minute issues out there that we'll bring up in the future. Most of the things will work well on. A lot of people don't know this, but since I've been governor, more than 97% of the bills I signed into law have more than just Republican votes. So most of the things that I sign into law, most of the things we work with the legislature on, have votes from Democrats as well as Republicans. I think there are things like that we can work on in the future. There's occasionally going to be some differences, and that's worth having if they're not based on principle. But in areas where we're just going to get off in the weeds, they're going to distract us from those larger priorities, I'm going to get us back on track.
I know you said right to work isn't a priority for you, isn't on your agenda, but it's on the agenda of some in the legislature, and 2 states near us, Michigan and Indiana, have it. So does that put more pressure on both you and those legislators or our businesses? Does it make right to work inevitable? That's what I'm saying.
No, I don't think so. I mean, 2 of our biggest competitors are Minnesota and Illinois. In fact, it wasn't here, but another publication I saw recently did a headline that showed something like 4,000 jobs in the last 2 years in Kenosha. It's not exclusive, but in large part because of jobs coming from Lake and Cook County. They're not coming up because of the right to work issue, because Illinois isn't going anywhere in that same way that Minnesota is. They're looking at it because of the job climate. They're looking at the business climate, the tax climate, the regulatory climate. Businesses, yeah, look at that, but you know, if you look at states that have right to work, they also, in many cases, have lower non-existence business or income taxes. They have a relatively conducive regulatory and litigation climate. They have a lot of other issues that we're trying to work at, and I think if we're competitive in those areas, those are much, and even just access to a steady supply, well-trained, well-prepared workers. That part of anything these days is what's going to be the magnet for employers. I mean, you talk about folks in the M7 here, you talk with the MMAC and the GMC, you talk about with others around the state, they'll tell you the biggest single concern they have right now is workforce issues. Not just today, but as the baby boom generations at or near retirement, there's a tremendous amount of concern, particularly amongst manufacturers, that some of their best employees, some of their hardest working, well-qualified employees are near or at retirement age, and they need to fill it. So to me, those are infinitely more important issues.
Mabel, you want to jump in?
In last week's debate, you said you plan to serve 4 years as governor. Does that mean you will not run for president in 2016?
I said my plan is to run for the next 4 years. I mean, it's what my detailed plan, 62-page plan, talks about what I want to accomplish 4 years from now. You know, I've had to run 3 times in 4 years, so it's pretty crazy not to want to continue to be governor. And I think we're just getting humming. I mean, I think things are just picking up. I'd like to see this out. You know, it's flattering that people mention me in other lights out there, but it's not because I'm running around beating my chest about it. It's because people look at what we've done here in Wisconsin. They look at the accomplishments. They look at the change. They even look at the fact that even those, I met a guy yesterday who was from Seattle at a ceremony we had at the Capitol. He said, I'm a Democrat, but I just appreciate the fact you had the courage to stand up for your convictions. And he goes, I don't ever see that in politics. And so I think part of that is the attention we get is because we were willing to stand up and do what we thought was right in this state, and that we've accomplished some great things. I'd like to see us be able to do more of that over the next 4 years.
So you're not traveling to Iowa in the coming weeks?
No.
So
Iowa County was just over in Dodgeville the
it's
other
not,
day.
it's not just outsiders who are saying this about your presidency. In the current GQ magazine, some of your good friends, John Hiller and others, are saying you're going to run if you win. That you know
No, I
how
think
to
the quote
strike.
he actually said is he'd be crazy
strike.
not to. Those were his words, not mine.
But yeah, that you'd be crazy not to, and you know how to strike when the iron's hot.
Actually, I think anybody who wants to be president has to be a little crazy. So I don't know if I want to be classified as being crazy, but to me, I want to be a governor. I mean, I'm 46. I mean, if God willing, someday that was even something to consider. That's a long ways off.
If Paul
But-
Ryan runs, would you run?
Oh, I've said this before. If there was a Paul Ryan fan club, I'd be the leader of it. I think Paul Ryan is one of those rare breeds in politics. It's not just Democrat or Republican. I always say there's two kinds of people. There's people who want to be somebody great and people who want to do something great. Paul, whether you agree with him or not, I think most people who've worked with Paul realize he's the latter. He's somebody who wants to do something great. And he'll be successful whether he's the Ways and Means Chair, whether he's a candidate for president, or anything else he does.
So if he runs, you're not running.
It'd be hard to do if you're the president of the fan club.
Can we talk about Texas for a second?
Sure.
Texas. You said
Texas, not Texas, right?
no Texas. You said you wanted to eliminate or to cut income taxes further. You want to eliminate the corporate income tax, and you're interested in a flat tax. What do you want race to look like at the end of a second term? Are you going to move to eliminate corporate taxes? And what should be done with the earned income tax credit? You want that to be reduced? Because some Republicans said it should be increased.
Yeah, from our, well, I mean, there's a whole different, there's a whole
I understand.
spectrum, a tray of things that you've got there. I mean, I went, at the minimum, I went rates across the board for everyone in income taxes, and I want property taxes for the typical homeowner to be lower in 2018 than they are today. Which, and the nice thing is, if you take that a step back, it also means they'll be lower than before I started. Because property and income taxes this December, this year, are actually lower than when I started, which means they'll be even lower 4 years from now. Now, how much lower we can drive them, someone's going to be dependent on how effective our budget reforms are, how effective our growth in the economy is. But my general principle is, I often joke about this, that, you know, Tonette and I were married almost 22 years ago, February of 1993. And I joke that one of the critical mistakes I made as a newlywed was I went to Kohl's for the first time after I was married and bought something at the price it was marked at. And so, of course, the joke is, I said, now I know if I'm going to go to Kohl's and buy a new Packers shirt, I buy it off the rack that says it was $29.99 and now it's $19.99. Then I go up and get my Kohl's credit card out and I get another 15% off. And then I get the flyer from Sunday's paper, which I get your paper, and you get the little scratch off there and get my 10 or 20 or whatever it is that month or that week. And then I go, because Tonette and I go there all the time, we get our Kohl's cash and we give it to the cashier. Next thing you know, they're almost paying me to buy that shirt. The reason I tell you that is I often ask groups out there when I talk at town hall meetings, so how does Kohl's make money? They make it off of volume, right? They could charge you a lot for that shirt and sell a few of them, or they can lower the price and spread the volume so that more people are buying their products. That's how I view taxes. I think we're better off, instead of having high rates that a few might be able to pay, is drive that down. I think that encourages more money back in the hands of consumers, of small business owners, of manufacturers and farmers and others who invest that in capital, of developers who put that into new projects, of entrepreneurs who start up new businesses. And so I want to keep doing all I can to squeeze that down so that that money flows throughout the economy, because I think that it's not just about lower rates. I think it's ultimately about building a better economy.
So what do you want race to look like when you're done?
Well, I'd like lower rates. I think, you know, even on the earned income tax credit, I mean, one of the other alternatives is you can just push the lowest rate down further and drop more people off entirely, so that, but you got to have a healthy balance. It's with all these things. Mm-hmm. The low rates got to tie into other programs of assistance that we have, because the last thing you want to do is provide a disincentive to work. I mean, sometimes people look at this well-meaning, well-intentioned people, but who'll say at some point, I hear this from employers all the time, who'll say, I want to work, I want this job, but oddly enough, could I get it for a lower pay, or so I can qualify for this? And so there's got to be a better transition to remove disincentives to work, or to work at some of these other jobs. So we want to make sure that whatever we do with the tax code, whether it's through the earned income tax credit or lowering rates at the bottom end, does so in a way that fits in with the other changes we're making. So there's a logical transition, so it's progression, so that people can ease into the workforce, because I think most people want to. And overall, I mean, I'd love to see not only lower rates, but flatter rates going forward, a simpler tax code, and one where we put a greater emphasis on people having more money in their pockets for their families. I'd love to see particularly less of an impact on retirees, because I think we lose far too much of our retiree income, not just at the wealthy end, but I think increasingly a lot of working class families or retirees are moving not just to Florida and Arizona, but to Texas and Tennessee and other ways. And we lose out on all that revenue. We lose out on all their gifts to charity and to churches and synagogues and other places out there as well.
So you're going to push for reform of the tax code in the next session?
I'd like to. The one caveat that I want to make clear, we talked about before, I think, Jason, we talked about this at the end of last year, was we're not looking for a swap. I want to do that through growth and through continuing to weed out waste, fraud, and abuse and create more efficiencies in government, not through not by creating a higher sales tax or something like that. That's an idea others have kicked around, but that's my approach. Is you do it by continuing to drive down the amount of money that it takes to run government through efficiencies, through waste, fraud, and abuse, and then through revenue growth by a healthier economy.
Is Kansas a cautionary tale for you?
Oh, I think we look at all different states. It's not just Kansas, but look at what's done elsewhere. You want to make sure, for two reasons. You want to make sure that what you're doing is it economically works, but you also want to make sure that politically that the steps that you take, per the message I mentioned before, that the lesson I learned from early on in the beginnings of Act 10 is you got to constantly communicate. You don't just communicate an election and then go out and do. You constantly need to be explaining to people, like I think any good leader does, and whether it's running a paper or running a small business or running any organization out there, you've got to constantly communicate to people, whether it's to the legislature, to the public as a whole, to stakeholders, what and why you're doing.
Governor, in terms of the transition that you made from the State Department of Commerce to the WEDC, did you try and move too quickly there? Could you have saved yourself some grief if you had given yourself more time to
Yes.
make that transition?
Yeah, I think so. I think, in fact, one of the things, thinking retrospectively, one of the things we should have done is a baseline audit. Because if you look even at the audit, the second half of the financial part of the audit Bureau put out, was actually from a couple of years ago, but that part just came out recently. For example, some of the discussion we had at our last meeting, you said, and it was about loans that have gone to the Department of Administration that in the past would have gone to the Department of Justice. Well, you might remember me asking this to one of the staff. Those are all loans that were made by the old Department of Commerce. Those aren't WDC loans. And so, not that and I even, in deference to this, I mentioned a couple that had been really long-standing that I referenced the Doyle administration on it, and not to beat up on them, but to say, had they not made those loans, I mean, they're outstanding loans, they're ones that we're carrying, they're ones that we get beat up over, even though we didn't have anything to do with setting them. But I'm not beating up on the Doyle administration, because in that far northwest part of the state, in that particular county, had they not done that, that business would have all but certainly gone out of business. Right.
Is what you're talking
And so I'm not, that's not a shot at my predecessor nor at my opponent on this particular issue, because I don't think they had any choice. But it is a good example where WDC gets beat up over it when it was probably a risky loan to make in the first place. The only slack I'll cut to the previous administration is the only thing riskier would have been the certainty that the plant would have closed down had they not done it. But that's a prime example where if we'd done a base audit, then you could have said, okay, where did things start at and where have they gone since? Not where are things now and how much of that is your responsibility and how much of the stuff that you inherited. And I think that was really the critical difference. But, other than just giving you a retrospective here, I don't spend too much more time on it, because to me that's more time rationalizing and less time actually getting things done. The good thing is the audit that the private audit that was done for this past fiscal year that we'll be reviewing at the next meeting is very positive. And probably one of the best things all along is that the frontline staff, the people who are out, the people who are on the ground working with the M7, working with MMAC here or with CABA or with Racine County Economic Development Corporation or all the other entities, they get constant praise. You talk to Jim Pash and the M7, they'll tell you, man, on the stuff, whether it's in Milwaukee or Kenosha or Racine, our field staff, the people at WDC are right on it. They're making right connections. You look at some of the big projects. Global Water Center would not have happened without WIDA and the WDC working together on that. You look at the new Energy Innovation Center up on the north side on the 30th Street corridor. That would not have happened without WDC's involvement. You look at some of the other targeted investments that we've made in this administration. You look at not just with WDC, but the $100 million that then leveraged over $100 million to the Transform Milwaukee project. Those are all things that were positive things that have happened because of WDC, in many cases a combination with WIDA, that I think are very positive. And so the things that were administrative hang-ups, some were inherited from the past, some were just a part of that quick transition. Those have been resolved.
The Legislative Fiscal Bureau says that the state would save $206 million over 2 years if you had accepted the full expansion of federal funding for Badger Care. Do you think that's still a good idea to have rejected that funding?
Yeah, and I'll tell you why. You look at in a parallel, so before I made my decision to cover everybody living in poverty, years ago my predecessor, Jim Doyle, raised eligibility for childless adults, but didn't put enough money in to cover it. So he raised the expectation that 200%, that all the people who were within 200% of the poverty level would be covered. But then the cruel reality was later, a good chunk of them, including many living at or below poverty, weren't covered because they didn't have the money for it. My point is, for a Congress and a president who not only can't deal with their $17 trillion debt today as we speak, but who can't even fulfill their commitments on Medicaid from the last budget. Last year, I had to put over $600 million in Medicaid just to cover costs to continue. More than a third of that new money I had to put in to cover Medicaid was from the federal government backing off on reimbursements for Medicaid. So previous commitments, levels that they had set at, they backed away on. If they can't make their current commitments for a federal government where the Congress and the president can't even deal with their own debt and deficit issues, I just think it's a fool's bet, to me at least, that they're going to come through in the next few years when they can't cover what they have now. And it's not just in Medicaid. Medicaid's the most obvious connection because it's the same pot of money. But they don't make their special education commitment. They don't make their commitment in a whole lot of other areas. So we're saying we should bet on a federal government that time and time again reneges on not all, but major portions of their commitments, has reneged even in this area in Medicaid, and now we're supposed to make an expectation to expand something on the promise that they're going to not only make up for what they reneged on before, but take on this huge amount going forward. I think that's a big challenge. Now, in our state, as you've heard me say before, we did something unique. We didn't just say no like some states did. We certainly didn't say yes like others did. We took, I think, a Wisconsin-specific approach and said, we're going to reduce eligibility down to 100%. That means we're going to cover, for the first time in our state's history, everyone living in poverty. No one living in poverty today doesn't have access to health care under Medicaid. We're going to transition people above that, and for someone who's an adult without a child, just living above the poverty rate, that means they're eligible for a plan with a subsidy for as little as $19 a month. So there is, legitimate access there. And then we're not going to expose the taxpayers. Now, many people chose to go into the exchange of that. Other people, we believe, chose to go into their own health insurance plan on their employer or the employer of their spouse. We think in the end it was a pretty reasonable, and it's not just us saying it. The Kaiser Family Foundation, which is pretty well respected, is not being partisan one way or the other, said we're the only state in the country that didn't take the exchange, that didn't take the Medicaid expansion, that doesn't have an insurance gap.
So who has been the toughest candidate you run against? Burt, Barrett, or Newman?
I know they're all unique. They're different. And in some ways it's tougher with somebody who doesn't have a record in office. On the other hand, obviously Mayor Barrett had, certainly a certain comfort level having run before, and as had Congressman Newman, and so there's strengths and weaknesses. They're each, it's unique. It's an interesting question, though.
Yeah, but I was just, you don't see this race as tougher than, this time.
I think this race is tougher, not so much because of my opponent. I think she's formidable. I've said this all along. I think she's formidable because because of her background, because of the way she can present herself, and not having a record largely allows her to define who she is and what she believes in. So I think from that standpoint, that's a challenge because you can kind of set it up for the campaign, not have to defend things of the past or as much things of the past. I think the reason why this is probably the toughest election is just because of all the outside influence. I mean, you've reported in the last couple months, you've had AFSCME, AFL-CIO, and NEA all come in nationally and say I'm their number one target. This summer alone, Craig Gilbert did a great piece, a few weeks ago, where, to his credit, he actually analyzed the numbers and found that on TV we were outspent. We're only finally starting to catch up, but through the summer we were outspent. It wasn't because of my opponent's campaign, in part it was, but it was largely because of all the other external money, most of which is funneled by the unions.
The external money this time seems to be less than it was in the recall. There was 30-some million spent then against you. This time, less than that.
Yeah, I think it's less, but I still think it's formal just because of, in the same way that we weren't drawing as much attention, because there's, as you know, there's plenty of other interesting races across the country, but we're the number one target. I was a little surprised actually they said that. I could see them coming in and saying, he's a top target, he's one of our targets. When they say they're number one, I mean, that kind of lays, a line in the sand down to say that they're not going to lose. And I think part of the reason they did that is, honestly, this is my opinion, I think they did that because we took their power away. We took the power of the big government special interests, the big government union bosses away, and put it in the hands of the taxpayers. And I think the reason they're coming at us so strong is not just because of what it means to Wisconsin. I think they're afraid that if I win in a state that's at best evenly divided politically, a purple state, it's probably more blue. You look at the Marquette numbers, there's more Democrats than Republicans. The only reason I'm ahead is because I'm way ahead amongst independents. But if I can win in a state like this and then be retained in a recall and reelected, I think many of those national leaders worry that not only other governors, but mayors and others across the country might actually feel emboldened to go out and think more about the next generation than just about the next election.
Governor, I have a question. Please, people, JS election hashtag is a hashtag that you can go to. A poll by the Pew Research Center says 1 in 4 Americans think that poor people don't work hard enough. And one of your ads, you ended by saying, we won't stop until everyone who wants a job can find a job. Do you believe the poor are lazy?
No.
Why can't they find work then?
Well, I think there's a variety of reasons, a variety of different circumstances. In the same way that I don't think everyone who's started their own successful business gets it for the same way. Some work hard for a long time and then suddenly something pops. Some have it handed to them. Others are somewhere in between. Some are lucky enough to find a new gizmo while tinkering around with things. Others spend years doing it. So I don't think in any of these areas that boils down to just one scenario for why people are at certain positions in life. The reason I say that ad is because pretty straightforward. Everyone who wants a job can find a job. Our goal is if you want to work, if you're able to work, if you're interested in work, no matter what your circumstances, we want to be in a position where we're able to provide you the opportunities, not just to have the work created, not just to have the jobs out there, but as we talked about before, to have the ability to give people access to the skills that they need, the education they need, the training. So whether it's an apprenticeship program, not just for someone who's not working, but in many cases for those who want a better job than they have today.
But in Milwaukee, there's numbers as high as 50% for a black male unemployment rate. So how do you explain that?
Well, I think it's a combination. I think one of the biggest challenges we have in Milwaukee is that we have an abysmal graduation rate. That statistically, if you have people that don't graduate, and it goes all the way down to part of the reason why I invested so much money into reading, statewide, but particularly to try and have an impact in Milwaukee and other metropolitan areas, is we just know statistically, if a young person is reading at or above grade level, by the time they leave elementary school, their chances of graduation go up exponentially. Conversely, we know if someone's not reading at grade level, by the time they're leaving elementary school, they're 4 times more likely not to graduate. If you had poverty as a factor, they're 13 times more likely. And so the challenge is if you have this cycle of folks, if folks aren't reading for a variety of reasons, it's not just about the education. A lot of times it's about the challenges. I remember talking to Superintendent Andrikopoulos along with many superintendents back, and when I talked to him, he used to say, boy, if I get kids to read, and if I could get kids to show up every day, there's not a kid I can't get an education to. So part of the challenges in parts of Milwaukee, too, are just keeping kids in the same neighborhood. They're at the same school, so they're going to school all the time. But we just know if we get help in those areas, Then if you get kids so that they're able to graduate, and it makes sense when you think about that statistic, because if a kid gets behind in reading, then suddenly the next grade, social studies, science, math, all those other things are dependent on you being able to read, and suddenly you just get disconnected. So my point to your larger question excuse me, is if we can get more young people to graduate, which starts all the way in elementary school with reading and even before that, get them to graduate. Statistically, we just know that their odds at that point of having an education that not just through high school, but then through apprenticeship or a tech college or a university go up dramatically. If we don't, then we got to figure out a way, how do we go back and help those individuals get caught up on that? Because that's the biggest challenge out there.
Well, then this gets to the point of cutting funding to public education. How does that factor into that? If we know that we have to get young people reading and
We've added specific in public education. If you look at the money, I mean, we saved $3 billion, which all didn't have to go directly into property taxes. So school districts, unfortunately, Milwaukee was one of the last to use our reforms, but school districts that used our reforms have actually been, in many cases, able to put more money into the classroom. They've been able to pay teachers more. In fact, one of the interesting contrasts is all throughout the summer, my opponent was telling people about this example of how bad Act 10 was and pointing to a story she heard from someone in Neenah claiming that this guy's daughter rejected an offer to teach in Neenah to go teach in Minnesota. Well, a TV station in Green Bay actually did a little bit of investigative reporting and found out that the job she took in Minnesota was $5,000 less. The superintendent, Neenah, perked up and said, since Act 10, we've actually been able to pay teachers more than we were before. The reason is they found out in the report that she went there was because she wanted to be closer to a bigger city like the Twin Cities, but she actually got paid less. And so for districts, you just look at I talked to Dr. Bonds about this, you just look at the amount of savings that Act 10 will provide in terms of the unfunded liability for the retirement system in MPS. That is a dramatic savings. That's real money that goes in. And since our reforms, we put over $400 million in the K through 12 education this last budget. We've added particular funding in areas for reading specialists, which help NPS and other schools across the state. We've targeted other programs, not only in the schools. I put money statewide into the After 3 program we fund for the Boys and Girls Club, largely driven by talking with Vincent Lyles and others here in Milwaukee who successfully had the Boys and Girls Club helping with after-school reading programs, and wanted to fund that and then expand it across the state. So I think we are best. The difference is, do we spend money on the bureaucracy or do we spend it on the classroom? I would contend overwhelmingly either we directly spend it or we've given school districts the ability, if they use it, to directly spend it. By next year, the only school district left that won't be using our Act 10 reforms, ironically, is Madison, where my opponent is obviously on the school board. And I think the particular concerning thing about that is not only could they save millions of dollars by simple things like bidding out their health insurance and using some of our other reforms to save property taxpayers, that's great, but I think the better example is to address real issues. A lot of people in Milwaukee are surprised to know that the African American graduation rate for students in Madison is actually worse in Madison than it is in Milwaukee. And so they've got some real challenges there, and to me it's not a coincidence. Some of the biggest challenges are in districts where they have not yet fully embraced the Act 10 reforms.
Okay, we're right at an hour. How about one more question? Marty, do you want to take it?
Just, when you look at polling and you look at where your opponent is with women, minorities, and young people, are these people not getting your policies? Is the message wrong? What do you account for that?
And I'm assuming you're going to ask about all the other groups that are with me, my opponent, next week.
That's women, that's a pretty big group of people in Wisconsin.
Well, but I would say all the other groups that Craig Gilbert did a nice story and showed up all the high marks there as well on the flip side of the equation. I think some of those issues are just historic patterns. They're not unique to me. If you look at Republican, Democrat, you could make in the last, dozen or so elections similar parallels to that. So there's not a huge gap from where Republicans have been in presidential, gubernatorial, and U.S. Senate elections. I think for a lot of this, it's a matter of getting our message out, getting our story out. And we're not conceding any votes in the state of Wisconsin. We just had in Milwaukee about a week or so ago, Tonette and I sat down with, I think it was about 300 women up on the northwest side of Milwaukee. I think there was me and maybe 3 or 4 other guys. That was it in the whole room. And we talked about issues that people thought were important as voters. The issues those voters told me about, the women in that room, were they reminded me, which statistically is true, that they as women are much more likely statistically to manage their household budget, not their husbands or their significant others. And so we talked about the $322 on average a typical family was going to benefit from our reforms. They talked about as parents, how much we cared about our kids' education. So we talked about how our reforms have improved education in this state. Graduation rates up, ACT scores up, reading scores up. They cared very much about that. Many of them talked about not just their kids, but their kids or grandkids in college. We talked about our UW tuition freeze and how important that was for not only for the students, but working families out there. And then we talked about a lot of things that most people don't know about, read about, hear about. And that is all the other significant investments I made. They're important to everyone, but particularly for the women in that room, found to be very interesting. The $15 million I invested into domestic violence prevention, including a huge match that put into a place that's just going to be up the street from here, a new Sojourner Family Peace Center. That is a comprehensive center for not just as a shelter, but for services that include the schools, law enforcement, all the other things that not only help the victim, but help the family, the children of that victim, the child abuse prevention components in there, the things we've done with that, the $30 million I put into mental health treatment, the largest amount in a quarter century of any governor. The new program I invested in, a better bottom line to help people with disabilities be placed into gainful employment in communities all across the state. The Carbone Cancer Center expansion to help provide greater access in impoverished and rural areas, to make sure that those services through UW go to affiliates all across the state, to make sure that for women and children there's greater access not only to health care, but particularly to the highest advances in cancer treatment out there. Women in that room were shocked to hear a lot of those things because they don't hear about them a lot because they're not as controversial as some of the other things we talk about. I think when people hear about that, they go, well, that's pretty good. You got a pretty good foundation. We need to build off of that.
Governor Walker, thanks for being with us today. We appreciate it. And I want to remind our viewers that we'll be meeting tomorrow with Mary Burke, the Democratic candidate for governor. That's at 10:15 tomorrow morning. And then Brad Schimmel, who's running for Attorney General on the Republican ticket, will be with us at 11 o'clock on Thursday. You can see the entire interview with Governor Walker on our YouTube channel, and we'll have excerpts at JSOnline later today. Thanks again, Governor Walker.
Thank you.
Thank you.